Today we're going to be having a look at societal values, but not just the numbers behind them. We're also going to be looking at two other things. Events that can trigger based on your position between the societal values, and unique government reforms that come in from having your societal values at certain levels. Do keep in mind I'm going to be using the console for this video, just so I can show all of the values right at the start of the game without having to wait to the end of the game to show them off. And to trigger events so I can show you them, so instead of just saying this event does X, you can actually see the event and you may recognize it and be aware of that it is associated with a certain societal value. So the only real thing I'm going to do with the console is I'm going to set the age to absolutism so that all societal values will be available. The reason I'm playing as Korea for this video is quite simple, because there is an extra societal value for countries that are close to the mandate of heaven. We have our synesized value. So let's start at the beginning. We have centralization versus decentralization. It used to be that in the first version of the game, centralization was just superior, but now it's more of a mixed bag. It's really a choice between decentralization with mass loyalty to subjects, or centralization where subjects are really disloyal. If we ignore subject loyalty, then the bonuses for centralization, I think, are just superior. That 50% extra crown power, that 10% minus proximity cost, goes much further than a simple +5 to a state satisfaction equilibrium. Though keeping in mind that a state satisfaction recovery is actually really good, because it affects how fast a states will recover to their satisfaction floor, which means if you push them really low, if you push their satisfaction really low, they'll increase much faster with stats like this. But still, I don't think these two are worth it. They're too small, I think, bonuses on their own to counter centralization's bonuses. The counter espionage versus espionage, I can kind of just leave it. It's not really a big deal, I think. It only affects how well enemy nations are able to spy on you, and I don't think it's a big deal. You can ignore this bottom modifier. I'll mention this, that because I'm using the console, a few modifiers will show up that are for the AI and don't apply to the player. I'll point them out when they show up, so ignore this one. This country importance modifier, it simply affects whether the AI prioritizes control or not. Moving on to events, there are 11 events associated with centralization and decentralization. Nearly every single one of them is a centralization event. There is only one, by my count, decentralization event, and it's a bad one, which clearly makes decentralization the worst of the two. Let me just show off that bad decentralization event for you. This is your bad decentralization event. Provinces want even more autonomy. Gives you a simple choice between increasing autonomy, decreasing control in a bunch of provinces versus losing 7th stab. A bad event. Like, there's no way around it. There's nothing positive about this event. It's simply bad. The exact triggers for this event is to have a decentralization of above 25%. And having any province outside your capital with a control level of at least 10%. So if, hypothetically, if your country didn't have 10% in any province outside your capital, this event couldn't trigger. And if you kept your decentralization value below 25, this couldn't trigger. But I said, simply a bad event. You really don't want this event to happen. It just doesn't give you anything positive. It'd be better not to get it. But that's our only decentralization event. So let's look more at the centralization events, where it's more of a mixed bag. But here is all of your centralization events. We'll start with the first one, which is this one. Centralization brings get benefits. The criteria for this event to trigger is simply having above 25 centralization, which would be minus 25 centralization in reality, because going down in this bar equals having centralization. This event's pretty great. It gives you just the centralized state modifier, which gives you +5 tax efficiency and plus 0.25 monthly control in all provinces and locations. It also lasts for 10 years, and it can trigger again once it expires. The only requirement for this event to trigger is simply staying at the certain level of centralization and not having the event be active. So definitely a good one. For our second centralization event, we have this one. Province frustrated by lack of autonomy. This is a bad event. The trigger for this event is having centralization at 25%, same with the last one, and having a location which is a core and has a control level of at least 5 by my reading. As you can see, both choices are negative, simply losing 10 prestige or losing prosperity in a bunch of locations. So let's move on to the next one. For our next centralization event, this is another just have your centralization at 25% and not have the modifier, which it just simply decreases the cost of hiring mercenaries. In Us They Trust, minus mercenary maintenance by 10%. A good event. Nothing really to say about it. It's simply good. If you like having mercenaries, even if you don't like having mercenaries, it doesn't give you anything bad. So it's nice to see an event that doesn't do anything negative. Next, we have another mercenary event, again associated with having a certain level of centralization. This event actually requires you to be at war and have hired a mercenary band. As you can see, if I hover over the criteria for this event, nothing happens because I don't have a mercenary company hired. All this event really does is increase the strength of the mercenary company that you have hired. As long as it's below about 80% of its strength, it will essentially increase by 20% or so, simply refilling its ranks. A nice event if you have mercenaries and use them, but I think a lot of players probably sleep on mercenaries, so it's not going to have a big effect. For our next event, we again just have a positive event, generous terms, which gives us the modifier banker interest -1. Again, nothing really outlandish with the triggers for this one, simply having 25 centralization plus at least one loan and not having this event already triggered will trigger this one. Then we have another good event for centralization, good advice, which simply increases the cabinet's efficiency by 10%. Again, the trigger for this one, simply not having this modifier already and having high centralization of at least 25% triggers it. As you can see, as you're starting to see, I assume, centralization has lots of good events with it, whereas decentralization has none, making it centralization a clear winner on the event front. Then we have another good event, People Show Resilience, which simply gives 7 stability. Though the requirement for this event is actually to have your stability at less than 30% or less than 30. So there's a good chance you won't see it unless your stability is actually getting really low. Again, the only criteria for this event other than having low stability is having the certain level of centralization, that being 25%. Then we have another good event for centralization, Support the War. If your war exhaustion is above 4 and you're at war, this event will simply decrease it by 2, as long as your centralization is at the right level. A very nice event overall. Now perhaps we have one of the worst events for centralization. I would say the worst event overall. This is Failed Administration. This requires you to have a stability of above -80, so you're probably going to get this one. Of course, you then need to have your centralization at 25%, but also all the states must have their estate satisfaction of at least 0.5, which is 50%. So hypothetically, if you kept an estate at 49% satisfaction, or just 49 satisfaction, this event couldn't trigger, which you may want to do, because the effects of this event are a bunch of gold, on the bottom option, or -20 stability. That's bad. This is a bad event, a very bad event. That is a lot of stability to lose just in one event. I think this event alone is enough to really counteract the positive events from centralization, but it is something to keep in mind. And for our final event for centralization, this is a bad one. It's simply, if you have a mercenary company that's around and you're at war and you have war exhaustion of at least 5, they'll simply demand more money from you to keep working. You can't say no, you can only just pay them. So there's no real way to avoid this event. You can see that nothing happens to me here because I don't have a mercenary company. The final thing to talk about with the societal values are unique government reforms. For centralization and decentralization, we have 2. We have one for decentralization and one for centralization. For our decentralization one, we have provincial taxation system. This decreases your crown power by 10% while giving a maximum tax of 5% plus an progress towards decentralization and progress towards liberalism. Personally, I really don't think this is a good reform. That +5 tax is kind of counteracted by the -10 crown power, because crown power goes a long way to increase your taxation. It increases your tax efficiency, it increases your state satisfaction, which increases how much they're willing to pay, as well as decreases the cost of maintaining your court, and increases the income you get from trade. So personally, I think that -10% would completely eclipse any gain from that +5 maximum tax. Do keep in mind that in order to have this reform, you must have a decentralization level of at least 50, and you must be in the age of Reformation, which is the 4th age. On the flip side, for centralization, we have a different reform. This one's a little more complicated to get. We have centralization of power. So this one requires you to have both 50% centralization and 50% absolutionism. So it's a lot harder to get than some reforms, which only require one of these things. But the benefits of this reform are pretty great. Just 20% crown power, no negatives, which is pretty great overall. The only thing else it does is increase you towards centralization, which you probably want, and absolution, which again you probably want if you have gotten to the point where you have 50% with each of them. This reform is harder to get though, because this reform only becomes available in the age of absolutionism, that being the 5th age, and as I said, requires you to have both of these. So if we compared it to the decentralized reform, which you could get an age earlier and you would only need decentralization to get, that one's definitely a lot easier, but I think this one is a lot better. And with that, we have finished looking at the centralization versus decentralization value. It's a pretty clear win, I think, for centralization, at least except for the early game where you're going vassal heavy, or if you plan to go vassal heavy in the late game. But if we think about things outside of the stats, the events for centralization are simply better, the reforms for centralization are simply better. It's hard for me to recommend decentralization unless you're going heavy on vassals. If you never plan to make a single vassal, decentralization is essentially worthless, and centralization easily completely blows decentralization out of the water. But that's just my view. For now, let's move on to tradition versus innovation. If we look purely at the numbers, and I'll ask you to ignore everything below stability, investment, ink cost, all of these four are AI modifiers, so please ignore them. At the max level of traditionalism, you gain 2.5 estate satisfaction equilibrium, which is nice. Obviously, it's always going to be nice. But then you get plus 200% to the cost of embracing institutions, which is going to make bracing institutions pretty costly. Then you have a 10% increase to culture tradition. I'll remind you, culture tradition is your defensive power of your culture and affects how fast this culture will be converted to other cultures, not how fast it converts those cultures. On top of that, you then finally get a stability investment cost of minus 20%, essentially decreasing the cost it takes to increase your stability by 20%, which is nice. On the flip side, for innovation, we decrease the cost of embracing institutions by 50%. We then increase our culture influence, which is the opposite of culture tradition, and instead increases the attack power of your culture, which represents how fast it will convert other cultures to its own. In reality, there are lots of benefits to having a higher attack power than another culture's defense power. Not only will you integrate nations faster that have lower defense power and assimilate their pops faster, but you'll also be able to get higher spy networks on them, and spy networks will have more effect, and sieges will actually be slightly easier. After that, we gain max 10% literacy, which is honestly a really nice stat. Literacy is always something you really want, except for certain pops like slaves. Literacy has nothing but benefits. And one of the hardest things in the game to do is actually increase the literacy of peasants, because there are very few sources to increase their literacy. And your average literacy rate actually affects how fast you research. So increasing your literacy rate for the peasants will do a lot to increase your research rate. For our final modifier, we have the plus 25% to the cost of your stability costs, which is basically just a counter to the decrease you get from traditionalism. Now, before we talk about the overall differences, let's talk about events. We'll first look at the traditional events. When it comes to events, traditionalism versus innovation is much more of a mixed bag. There are actually a lot of events. If we consider centralization, which only had around 11, and only one of them was decentralized. For traditionalism and innovation alone has 11 events. So I'm not going to list every single event like I did for centralization versus decentralization. Instead, I'll try to give you a broad idea of the events. As you can imagine, for innovation, a lot of the events either decrease your stability, which isn't really surprising, give you minus prestige, or give you research progress bonuses. In fact, one of the nicer events for innovation is this one. New thinkers arrive. The only criteria for this event is that you have innovation of at least 25, and that's it. And then you just get 5 research progress for free. That's it. You don't need to do anything other than have your innovation at a certain level, and then you just get free research. Definitely nice. But innovation actually starts to come gets access to some negative events. For example, once you reach the 6th age, that being Age of the Revolutions, you gain access to this event, Scientific Revolution halts, which loses you 5 in research progress. Another really good event for innovation is this one, Innovation Wave, which lasts for 10 years, gives you institution growth 25% and monthly research progress of 10% plus 0.2 to your growth to innovation, which are all nice if that's what you're going for. Funnily enough, innovation also has this military theory event, which gives you some army and naval tradition. So Overall, I would say event-wise, if you want good events for your research and institutions, then innovation is the way to go. But if you keep in mind that you will be getting negative events for stability and prestige. So let's think about traditionalism now. As you can imagine, traditionalism is really the exact opposite of innovation. It gives lots of events that give stability, but also some events that conflict with other religions you may have in your country. For example, this event, heresy, which will convert a bunch of pops in your country to another religion in your culture, in your religion group. Unfortunately, the criteria for this event isn't really anything. If you just have another religion in your religious group, which has a view of your religion of at least neutral, and you have your traditionalism at least 25, then a bunch of your pops will just convert to this other religion, which honestly isn't that big of a deal, but it's definitely not something you really want. Traditionalism also has this negative event, which simply just gives you minus 12 stability, which isn't really what you'd expect. You would think that this societal value would actually be the one to increase your stability, but no. But of course, there are good stability events like this one, Clerics Mobilize Population, which just gives you 12 stability and increases the estate satisfaction of the clergy by 10%. Like innovation, traditionalism actually has an event that can only trigger in the Age of Revolutions, where this one is far worse, giving you minus 10% research progress or minus 20 stability. Basically just a worse version of that existing event I showed in innovation. Something to keep in mind. When it comes to temporary modifiers, the traditionalism has this one, religious zeal, which just increases pop conversion speed by 25% for 10 years. Personally, I think this is a lot weaker than the innovation event, with it also gives a temporary modifier. I much prefer that institution growth and that research progress increase over just an extra 25% to conversions, though it could vary depending on if you're playing as a country with a lot of pops of another religion, of course. But if you're playing as a country that isn't really going to be conquering a lot of different religion provinces, I think tradition's a lot weaker here than innovation. Before we finish with innovation and traditionalism, let's look at the unique reforms they have. Innovation actually has two different reforms that it has access to. In the final age, the Age of Revolutions, they gain access to this visionary thinkers reform, which simply gives +5 literacy. Honestly, not that great, if only because you've probably got much better things to put your reform slots into. The other event, the other reform which they gain access to in the Second Age, that being the Renaissance, is this exchange of ideas, which gives monthly growth progress of 5% plus institution growth of 10%. This basically is exactly the same as that event that innovation gets, but a lesser version of it, where instead of getting research progress of 10%, you get 5, and instead of getting institution growth of 20%, you get 10. Since this reform becomes available in the Second Age, I think it's quite useful just to give you that extra edge on research progress, as opposed to the visionary thinkers, which you only really get at the end of the game. Keep in mind, though, this reform requires you to have both 50 innovation and 50 humanism. It synergizes in that way, making it harder to get than it otherwise would be. When it comes to traditionalism, you may be disappointed to find out there is not a single traditionalist reform, not even for theocracies. There is no traditionalist reform. There are reforms that increase traditionalism, but none that require traditionalism. With all that said, what are my final thoughts on the traditionalism versus innovation? I think it's a clear win for innovation. It has a lot of good events which can increase the rate at which you research tech, and tech is one of the most powerful modifiers in the game, as well as the fact that when it comes to reforms, traditionalism has none, whereas innovation has a lot. Though I will say, if for some reason, perhaps at the end of the game, you've reached a point where you've embraced every institution, and maybe you've researched everything you really want to research, then that would be the scenario where I think innovation kind of falls off. Because if let's say you've embraced every institution, then you don't really care about the embraced institution cost. If you've researched all the tech you want to research, you don't really care about getting good events to get research progress. And maybe you don't care about the literacy bonus, even though literacy is a bonus even for every pop, even if there's no research or institutions involved. I don't know. I can't think of scenarios where I'd prefer traditionalism. Maybe if I really need to reduce my stability increase, or maybe if I wasn't expanding, but a lot of my culture was in other countries, or a case where I wasn't expanding and really wanted my culture to have really high defensive power, but I can't think of a scenario like that really. or maybe one where I really needed estate satisfaction. Outside of the numbers, the events, I could only think of a situation where I'm conquering lots of other religion provinces, and I really want those events that give me conversion speed as being the only times I'd really want tradition. And on reforms, as I mentioned, tradition doesn't have any, so it's an easy win for innovation in that regard. But I would say innovation's reforms aren't that strong. I definitely think visionary thinkers is pretty weak, especially for how late in the game you get it, that being the final age. And the other reform, exchange of ideas, is a lot harder to get because you need high humanism as well as it. But I would say it's a pretty good event just for that +5 to your research progress, which could then stack with the event that gives +10, which will then of course increase further due to increasing your average literacy. I think getting all of those things together could really propel your research progress. Now, we've dealt quite a long on innovation versus traditionalism. Let's move on to spiritualism versus humanism. Straight from the onset, the differences between humanist and spiritualism are pretty obvious. Spiritualism converts pops faster while decreases pop assimilation rate. And for humanist, it's the opposite. It decreases the conversion speed and increases the assimilation speed. But to add on to that, spiritualism also increases how unhappy religions will become due to antagonism. It also increases the amount of pops in every town and city by 20, amount of cleric pops in every town and city by 20, and increases tolerance of the true faith by 2. Whereas humanist decreases how unhappy religions will get due to antagonism and increases the tolerance of heretics and heathens by 1 each. You can ignore the rest of this stuff because this is for AI. Now let's take a little look at events. For events, both societal values have a lot less than traditionalism versus innovation. They each have 5 each. Spiritualism actually has an event that increases research progress, called this monastic intellectuals event. So it does give you the option of considering research unholy, which will increase monthly control, decrease proximity cost, and increase prosperity while decreasing research speed and decreasing tolerance of heretic beliefs by 1 for 5 years nationwide. So this could be pretty good if you don't really care about research progress and you just want to decrease your proximity cost even further. The criteria for this event is to have your spiritualism above 25%, but you also need access to monasteries. If you're a religion or a culture or for whatever reason that can't build monasteries, you cannot get this event, so do keep that in mind. Outside of that, I wouldn't say there's much noteworthy about spiritualism. It does have this event, Militant Faithful, which give you some free soldiers in your capital, though they are mercenaries, or just gives you 2 stability and 15 prestige. The criteria for this event is actually to have your spiritualism at 75%, which is really high for a few mercs. And do keep in mind the amount of mercs it will give you seem to always be 4. So even if you're hundreds of years in the future past the start date, you'll always just get 4 mercs. I suppose they might change based on the kind of infantry you have. For example, they start off as footmen since that's the age we start in, but I guess if you were in later ages, they would be whatever unit type you currently have available as infantry, so that you could potentially get some good infantry. But remember, they do count as mercenaries, so they're not going to stick around. And even though they're mercenaries from an event, they still cost money. So do keep that in mind. Moving on to humanist, they have this event which requires them to have 50 humanism, which gives the option of under every faith a human, which gives not only 2 stability, but increases the tolerance of heretic beliefs by 2 for 5 years. And that's for both heretic and heathen beliefs. If you're conquering a lot of different religion territory and you're struggling trying to keep them happy, events like this could be very helpful. Because even if you're slowly converting those pops to your religion, you may face big rebellions simply due to the unhappiness that comes from the lack of tolerance. So being able to just get 2 tolerance essentially for free just from an event is definitely nice. You do have this other option to just say, we must not avert our eyes from heretics, which gives you the hypocritical ruler modifier, which decreases tolerance of heretics and heathens, but gives estate satisfaction for clergy 5 for 5 years. I'm not sure why you'd ever pick this, honestly. Like innovation, the humanism also gives events that increase research progress, but here it only increases it by 2.5, but it does give you access to another option that increases stability by 2.5, while of course pushing you towards stability, spiritualism, or pushing you towards humanism for the top one. This event only requires having 25 humanism, so it's pretty nice, especially if you decide you don't want to stick to humanism and want to start pushing towards spiritualism. You could just have this event trigger and just push you by 5 towards spiritualism. That's it for events. I think both events for both spiritualism and humanism aren't really that great. There's nothing that really made my eyes bulge out. So let's take a look at government reforms. When it comes to spiritualist ideas, I actually had to jump over to a different country to show off this one, which is enforce religious adherence, which gives monthly religious influence of 0.25. So this reform can only be used if you're playing as a religion with religious influence, like Catholic or Orthodox. Most of the Eastern religions don't have any form of religious influence and so cannot get this reform. So if we'll just jump back to Korea for a moment. The second reform that spiritualists can get is this punishment of heresy reform. This can only be gone in the Age of Reformation and after. It gives conversion speed 20%, while decreasing tolerance of heretic beliefs by 1 and pushing you towards spiritualist. And those are all the spiritualist reforms. Pretty weak if you ask me. So let's check humanist. As I mentioned before, there's the exchange of ideas, which requires innovation and humanism, so I'm not going to go over that again. Then we have this humanitarian administration, which simply gives you cultural capacity of plus 20%. Not amazing in my view. It also pushes you towards free subjects. And that's all of the reforms for humanism as well. To sum up spiritualism versus humanism, I don't think either of them is that powerful. It's really a choice. Do you want to convert pops faster to your religion, or do you want to convert them to your culture? Also, do you want a synergy with innovativeness? If you're going for innovativeness, I think going for humanism as well is a smart idea, because you can gain access to that reform, the exchange of ideas. But outside of that, I don't think humanism or spiritualism will really change the game in a major way with their reforms and events. Though they do have nice events, that I don't think they're as powerful or that interesting as perhaps other events. Now let's move on to serfdom versus free subjects. To start with, I've never been quite sure why in serfdom peasants and labourers eat a lot more food than in free subjects. They eat 10% more food, while free subjects eat minus 10%. I suppose because they're free, we don't have to feed them, so they can just starve, it doesn't matter. Whereas serfs, as we know, always eating a very hearty meal of a lot of food. So if we look at past the food thing, serfdom gives raw material output 10%, as well as supply limit in your locations plus 10%, as well as maximum tax for the peasantry estate of plus 20%. That's a lot of tax. And on the other side, free serfdom tries to make up with that by losing 10% tax, which in reality would mean losing 30% tax, because at max serfdom you have 20%, then at max free subjects you'd lose that 20%, then lose an extra 10% on top of that. It tries to make up with it with a promotion pop speed of 100%, and don't get me wrong, pop promotion speed is very good, but I'm not sure it's minus 30% tax is good. You would then of course get an extra 0.225 prosperity. When it comes to events, it doesn't seem like there are any actual serfdom events, which actually sounds really shocking. I bet you sound shocked. But every event related to serfdom requires you to have at least 25% free subjects. If you yourself look in the files and are able to find these serfdom events that I'm sure exist, like I'm finding it hard to believe they don't exist, please let me know, because I'm looking through the files and I'm just not seeing them. With that in mind though, let's take a little look at these free subject events, I guess. Straight off the bat, free subjects have access to this free thinkers are not prosecuted event, which gives a very nice plus 15% monthly research progress for 10 years. And the only cost to have this event is simply having your free subjects level at least 25. And of course, not having the modifier already active. You then gain access to this other event, fair laws embraced by everyone, which gives the state satisfaction equilibrium a nice 1, and then tax efficiency plus 2.5, which is pretty great, especially early game where there aren't that many sources of tax efficiency. Though do keep in mind for that event to trigger, you need the advanced codified laws, though most countries should start with unlocked because it's one of the first advances in the game. In fact, these are the only two negative events for free subjects. One increases the clergy's satisfaction by 10%, the other one just makes some of your neighbouring countries lose opinion of you. The requirements for this event to trigger is that those neighbouring countries have a societal value for their free subjects to serfdom at 25% serfdom. So they have to be at least as deep into the serfdom as you are into free subjects, that being at 25. Hypothetically, if you had no neighbours that were doing that, this event couldn't trigger. So overall, I'd say serfdom definitely loses the event race between it and free subjects, simply because it doesn't have any events. And free subjects and the free subjects events are actually pretty good, given there's quite a few permanent temporary modifiers, plus some just nice stability and legitimacy events. On the reforms front, it's actually a clear win for serfdom. If there is only one reform for both serfdom and free subjects, and it is this: universal serfdom, which requires you to have your serfdom at 50%. This reform's pretty great. Just 33% crown power. Just there you go, nice and easy. And then just decreasing the power of the peasants. So there's not really any situations where you'd want to increase the power of an estate. I suppose if you're in a situation where you want to increase the power of the peasants to counteract another estate like the nobles. But honestly, I think that's pretty minor situation. But that 33 crown power, oh, that's definitely nice. And that push towards absolutionism is also nice. This reform can be gotten in the Age of Discovery, so you'd get it quite a bit before absolutionism actually shows up, but it's definitely nice to get as early as possible. With all that said, my thoughts on serfdom versus free subjects? I think free subjects obviously wins the event race. It has much better events because serfdom doesn't have any, and nearly all of the events free subjects have are pretty good. On the other side, serfdom obviously wins the reform race by actually having a reform where free subjects has none. Plus, I think the modifiers for serfdom are simply better. That 10% raw material output, that 20% tax for the peasants state, and all you have to do is feed your peasants and labourers a little more. I will admit the pop promotion speed from free subjects is actually really good, but there are other ways to increase pop promotion speed, like stability, for example. Increasing your stability will also increase pop promotion speed. At 100% stability, you'll have the same effects as 100% free subjects, that being 100% promotion speed. I suppose together, if you had both stability maxed and free subjects maxed, you'd have 200% pop promotion speed, which sounds pretty good. But as I said, I think serfdom definitely wins that one. Now, I actually missed Autocracy versus Plutocracy, so we're going to do that one now. When it comes to Plutocracy, the costs are pretty clear. It increases the nobles' power by 50%, and as in most nations, nobles will be your strongest estate right at the beginning. It makes the strongest estate even stronger. It then increases the cost of the court by 2, but then provides 5 discipline, as well as 10 possible nobles in towns and cities. While on the other side, Plutocracy provides 100 burghers in towns and cities, increases the burgher power by 50%, much like it did the other side did with the aristocrats. Then it decreases the cost of court by 2, increases your trade efficiency by 2, and the rest of this stuff is all AI things. With all that said, let's look at events. When it comes to event, Autocracy has 13 and Plutocracy has nearly 20. Wow. Autocracy's events are kind of a mixed bag. There's a lot of events that just decrease the satisfaction of an estate. Sometimes the peasantry, sometimes the burghers, sometimes the autocrats themselves. But it does have some nice modifiers like serfs exploited here, which gives 10% raw mineral output, or this complaint, which gives you 10 prestige at a cost of 10 burgher satisfaction, or you can increase the burgher satisfaction while pushing towards plutocracy. On the burgher side of things, we have quite a few nice events, but quite a few negative ones. We've got this tolerance for all event, which gives a 2 tolerance to heretics and heathens for 10 years. You might be mistakenly think this is an event for another societal value, but nope, this is for plutocracy. You've also got another event like this agricultural boom, which just increases production of foods by 10% each, and then a 5 for just food in general for 5 years. You've got events like this, Our Rights, which just give stability, legitimacy, as well as estate satisfaction for the burghers. You've got this For Freedom event, which gives 10% morale and estate satisfaction for the burghers. You've got Mercenaries Flock to the Standard, which increases the cost of hiring mercenaries by 25%. You've got this In the Colours, which gives you some manpower. You've got this Burghers Please, which gives you a bunch of gold and their happiness. You've got this Our People Revel in Freedom, which increases the happiness of the peasants and the burghers. You've got this Better Administration, which gives 5 research progress. It's not all good though, obviously. You've got events that lose manpower, events that lose stability, events that lose estate satisfaction for the nobles, which shouldn't be surprising, events that lose you prestige, events that even further decrease the happiness of the nobles, events where nobles complain and you lose the favour with them, or you increased the push to autocracy. So really, between autocracy and plutocracy, I'd say plutocracy is better. I think it has better events with better modifiers, and unlike autocracy, which has lots of events that decrease the happiness of burghers and peasants, the plutocracy just has events that decreases the happiness of the autocracy, which honestly kind of might be a bigger deal, because the autocracy would be your most powerful estate at the start. So events that make them unhappy are going to be more dangerous than events that make the peasants or burghers unhappy. But let's get through this first, and I'll talk about the overall thoughts with the events combined with the stats of the societal value. So let's look at reforms. There are no actual reforms for either plutocracy or aristocracy, but I think this one, Enlightened Aristocracy, is supposed to require humanism and aristocracy. Because if I look in the files, it says where it should probably say requires focus humanism and requires focus aristocracy. It just says hashtag aristocracy and hashtag humanism. So I assume, maybe I'm crazy here, but none of the other reforms has hashtag with a societal value in it. So I think this is a case where these are supposed to be a humanist aristocracy law. On the face of it, it simply increases max literacy for nobles by 5 and decreases the cost of the court by 1. Honestly, I don't think this is that great. It's better than plutocracy because it doesn't have any reforms, but even so, I wouldn't say this is that good of a reform. Nobles usually have an easy time having high literacy because there's lots of things that push their literacy higher. Decreasing the cost of the court by 1 is nice, and if you are going max aristocracy, it would essentially take off 1 of the cost of being max aristocracy, but I think there are better reforms overall, and I wouldn't really recommend this one. With all that said, my thoughts on the reform? I think plutocracy's an easy winner, simply because at the start of the game you kind of want to weaken the aristocrats. They're the all-powerful estate that is taking a lot of the power away from your crown, and the bonuses from staying with them, well, I mean, there aren't many. There's this 5% discipline, that's about it. Plus a few events which might be beneficial, like where they give you money. But then I'd say there's more negative events than there are positive events, whereas plutocracy, I would say, is the opposite, where it seems to be about half and half, and some of the good plutocracy events are actually really good, giving temporary modifiers. Personally, I would rate events that give temporary modifiers for 5 or 10 years as the highest form of event, depending upon how good the modifier is. And plutocracy has some really good ones, like 10% morale for 10 years, agricultural boom that gives you a bunch of food, fair laws that increase tax efficiency and stability and estate satisfaction. And unlike aristocracy, which has events that angers both peasants and burghers, the events for plutocracy only tend to anger the aristocrats. And even in those events where you have options to appease the aristocrats, you don't usually lose burgher happiness from appeasing them, funnily enough. And that's without even thinking about the actual benefits from going plutocracy are a lot better than going aristocracy, which is kind of mainly negatives. You don't really want to increase the cost of your court. You don't really want to increase the noble powers. In a way, I think aristocracy and plutocracy is one of the only reforms where you kind of want to stay in the middle if you want to ensure that your crown power is at max by decreasing power of both the nobles and the burghers by staying in the center. But for me, I'd say this is a clear win for plutocracy. I'm sure some people will disagree, if only for that 5% discipline. And I think that 5% discipline is pretty good in the early game, but as you go on, having slightly better soldiers is going to become less important, whereas having a much stronger economy and therefore fielding more soldiers is more important, which is why I think plutocracy is better in the long term. We're actually going to call the video there, if only because this has gone on way longer than I thought it would, and I don't really want this to become like a 2-hour video, so I'm going to cut it down a lot. But consider this part 1. I want to do a part 2 on some of the other reforms, and then probably a part 3 to finish up. Let me know what you thought. Is there something I missed? I'm sure, looking through the files, I'm 100% there's probably some stuff that I've missed, or something I didn't touch on that I should have. Let me know if you found this helpful. Do you want to hear about do you care enough to hear about the other values and the events they have and reforms they have access to? Or do you simply not care about any of this? I'll probably do it anyway because I care. So thank you for watching, and maybe not see you next time. I might be making this video just for myself, and that's fine. But I'll see you next time regardless.